early drakes used to be very valuable. They would help you snowball your team as a whole, and they're a great way for putting pressure on heavy scaling enemy team comps. It was rare that there wasn't a fight around the first drake, because it was the only epic monster to play for on the map, at least until herald spawned. Things have changed since then. There are far more snowballing mechanics in the game, and because of that, games don't last as long as they used to. The void grubs that were introduced at the start of season 14 played the biggest impact, lowering the value of early drakes. Initially, people didn't know what to think about the void grubs. Some thought that the turret pushing power was really strong and worth playing for, others disagreed. I was one of the players that disagreed. To this day, I still have a video on my YouTube channel titled Void Grubs Are Overrated. In patch 14.8, Riot added some major changes to grubs though. The biggest one was the damage over time from each stack of Touch of the Void getting doubled, not to be confused with Hunger of the Void, which is what you would get from 5 or 6 grubs. Since then, it's been changed to 4 or 6. This increase in threat to not only plates but turrets as a whole easily overcame the downsides of playing for grubs that I talked about in my original video. Something I learned later on in the season was how valuable killing the first set is, particularly for the jungler. 2 full clears plus grubs gives you level 6 while the enemy bot lane is still level 5. As long as you're quick, they don't have time to hit 6 yet, unless they got an abnormal amount of XP from early kills. This makes it much easier to set up ganks, preferably dives, during that window. It is extremely replicable. Of course, it doesn't work every single time because things can happen. An example is if one of your bot laners is low resources or out of lane. But just because it didn't work once or twice doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking to practice it on champions that have a strong level 6 spike. It's a very valuable skill to have. If nothing else, denying your opponent from being able to do so is also fantastic. I know I already talked a bunch about Void Grubs, but don't forget about the Season 14 changes to Rift Herald. The Season 14 Rift Herald is noticeably better at speeding up the game than the Season 13 version. Being able to use the charge more than once roughly evens out the value that was lost from it going from 2 Heralds a game to 1. If you manage to kill enough Void Grubs to spawn some lovely Void Mites whenever your Herald charges into a turret, the turret push becomes undoubtedly better. Being able to control the charge creates so many opportunities. You could kill one turret mid lane and then with the next charge, kill a side lane turret, or vice versa. You also have the option to start fights with the mobility and knockup given from the charge. During really desperate times, you can also use it as an escape because you can't be CC'd nor damaged. Of course, you do need to watch out for your opponents killing it though, especially if their jungler is nearby with smite up. The only downside of the new Herald is that you can no longer get plates with it since it spawns at 14 minutes. The average solo queue lobby lasts roughly 30 minutes once surrenders are not included. Lower ranked lobbies typically have longer games than higher ranked lobbies, but the difference between the two is still fairly minor outside of the extremes. When the surrendered games are added into the equation, the margin is even smaller. The average game is under 30 minutes, regardless of rank. Whenever you're considering if you want to play for Dragon Soul or not, keep that in mind. Even if you were to kill every dragon right on spawn, you're looking at around 21 minutes. That's your absolute best case scenario. Anytime you spend not on the Drake pushes that back, but more importantly, any Drake the opposing team takes pushes it back more than 5 minutes. Not only does it take 5 minutes for the next Drake to spawn, but you also have to consider how long it took them to kill the Drake after it spawned. It's not going to be instant. A common analogy given for Dragon Soul or heavy scaling comps is a time bomb. The goal, of course, is to simplify the message. Threatening a stronger position later in the game puts your opponent into a lot of pressure. They have to find a way to overpower you before you meet whatever threshold you're aiming for, or the game is over. An important thing to note with this analogy is that a time bomb blowing up, such as in Counter-Strike, guarantees a loss for the opposing team. Dragon Soul and or heavy scaling team comps in League do not. It is still possible to throw the game after meeting the conditions, although the odds are lower, obviously. Speaking of, these are the odds of winning that I could find for each type of Dragon Soul. It's very important that I address this potential counter argument because I'm sure it's going to be a common take from some of you watching this video. These stats I found in League of Graphs, but unfortunately, they look very outdated. Whenever I sort by a specific region, all the stats go to not applicable. There's no stats on Grubs win rate, and one page still says first Rift Herald since there used to be 2. I tried looking at other sites and I couldn't find anything helpful. If somebody knows a good website that has that stat information for win rates, please let me know. This is a smaller part of my argument, but it's still worth considering. Out of all your games with Dragon Soul that turn into a win, how often do you think the soul buff swayed the outcome of the remaining fights? Were you going to win the game regardless? If a teammate gets caught, that's often enough for the game to be snowballed into a loss, even with soul, because the enemies can start a 5v4 fight, or at least have all 3 lanes pushing at once. Compare that to Elder Dragon buff. It's really hard to lose with Elder, even if one player gets caught. Of course, if 2 players get caught in either situation, the game is probably over. The last point of this video is, do you need to fight for either objective? Even if you don't want to fight over Grubs, there are still other options to consider besides clearing the Drake. You could use this time to catch up on tempo or set up a dive. This applies for all roles. Every champion has the potential to benefit from an earlier recall, push out an extra wave, or deny the opponents their opportunity to play the game because you're killing them under their turret.